Welcome to Southeast Asia Week 8. This week we're looking at the Philippines. And this is a really interesting country to look at in Southeast Asia because it differs so much from everything else we've looked at. So if we just review here for a minute, we realize that we started out in Indochina. We started out with Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, which was known as French Indochina. And we talked about, especially in terms of Vietnam, how China and Confucianism and Buddhism so influenced Vietnam. We talked about the French influence as well. And then we also talked, if you remember, about Thailand, and Thailand was the only country not to be colonized by European powers in Southeast Asia. We talked about British colonies in Malaysia, in Singapore, and also in Burma. In fact, we read a book about Burma called Where China Meets India, which shows that a lot of those British colonies were affected early on and influenced by both China and India, by things like Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, by a lot of Chinese and also Indian immigrants. And then we moved to Indonesia, which was especially influenced by Islam, and also, of course, by the Dutch. And during this whole time, we talked about, how Japan during World War II overran most of Southeast Asia. Now, as we move to the Philippines, we're looking at something that is very different from what we've looked at before. Like Indonesia, it consists of thousands of islands, in this case over 7,000 islands. And like Indonesia, it has a major population of 100 million. It has a large major island in the north, which is the most populous island, Luzon. And there, the largest city is Quezon, and also other large cities include Angeles and the capital at Manila. Like Southeast Asia, and we've spoken of this before, the Philippines has a tropical climate, and it is part of the Pacific Ring of Fires. That is, it is subject to earthquakes and volcanoes, and it is also subject to typhoons. So this northern part is really very heavily Roman Catholic. It's not till you get down into this section that you get more the influence of Islam in the large island of Mindanao in the south. So, now here's the interesting thing. In contrast to the rest of Southeast Asia, the Philippines was less permanently influenced by China, India, Hinduism, and Buddhism. Islam had some influence in the south, particularly as we noted on the island of Mindanao. And here you see a wonderful map that shows the extent of the influence of Islam. So unlike these other places in Southeast Asia, the major influences for the Philippines were Spain, Roman Catholicism, and the United States. Because of the Spanish colonization, the Philippines is overwhelmingly Roman Catholic, and then the Spanish lost the Philippines to the United States, which then prepared the Philippines for its independence in 1946. So, if you know a little bit about Spanish history, or especially about Latin American history, or about Catholicism, or about U.S. history, then I think you'll have a pretty good understanding of the more recent history of the Philippines. Now, what we do know by checking out the CIA World Fact Book, which is a good place to find, GDP per capita, is that in 2013, the GDP per capita, that is per person in the Philippines, was less than $5,000. Now, of course, all this data is given in U.S. dollars. That it was 165th, the ranking was 165th of 228 countries where the GDP per capita was compared and contrasted. So you can certainly see another major theme here of the Philippines, and that is the Philippines still are a poor place, but not the most poor place in the country and in the world, but they still are relatively poor. And this GDP per capita is also swayed by the fact that there are a number of very wealthy people in the Philippines. So it is a place where, you know, income inequality is a basic problem, where there are, you know, very poor, and where there are wealthy people as well. And this has remained a problem throughout its history. Now, as we said, there was some influence of Islam in the south, in the area of Sulu, where a sultanate was established, and also on the island of Mindanao, where Islam was also a major force. In 1521, the Spaniard, Ferdinand Magellan, landed in the Philippines in his attempt to circumnavigate the world, and he claimed it for Spain. He and his entourage became involved in a dispute with the natives there, and actually Magellan lost his life. He was killed by the natives in the Philippines, and of course others carried on his circumnavigation of the world, the first in history to do so. So it wasn't really until a few decades later that colonization was attempted by Spain in 1565 under the leader Miguel López de Legazpi. And from 1565 to 1821, rather surprisingly, the Philippines was administered from the Viceroyalty of New Spain in the New World, that is, in the Americas. So Spain, its New World possessions included parts of the United States and what is now Mexico, and of course all throughout Central America, Nicaragua, Guatemala, El Salvador, and all of this was part, including Caribbean islands, of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. And from here is where the administration of the Philippines occurred. And so for a good period of time, from 1565 to 1821, it was administered by New Spain, except for 2 years during the 7 Years' War, when Great Britain took hold of the Philippines. Now, what made Spain rich was its New World possessions and its possessions in other places throughout the world. And in terms of the Philippines, there was a vast trade network that existed between the two major ports, and it was controlled by the Spanish crown. And it was called the Manila-Acapulco trade. And so you see Manila over here in the Philippines, and you see the orange, which stands for the Spanish possessions in trade. And then you see how this would continue on to Acapulco on the west coast of Mexico, which of course has become a great tourist attraction, and which certainly before the 19th century was a very wealthy city and one that was part and parcel of this trade. So what happened in this trade? Well, Europeans and the peoples of the New World, the colonizers in the New World, loved the silken spices that were coming from China and Southeast Asia. So coming out of Manila with the Spanish galleons, at least once a year, were products like silk and spices. And of course, the Chinese and the Asians really didn't have any need for any European goods, which the Chinese certainly saw as vastly inferior to their own. And the Chinese always kind of regarded the rest of the outside world as barbaric, right, as barbarians. But the Chinese did like silver, and so what went the other way from Acapulco to Manila and then eventually moved on into China was silver. And during this Manila-Acapulco trade, perhaps as many as 400 million silver pesos moved across the centuries. Now, the Philippines, like many Spanish colonies, really was involved in a very kind of exploitative colonial system. And the Spanish were known for their kind of racist ideas in terms of, where you were born and who you intermarried with, etc. And some of these terms that we're going to be using here, you're probably already familiar with if you, for instance, you've taken Latin American history, because some of the same terms are used. So the reference to the indigenous peoples of the Philippines, they were called Indios. And those born in Spain were called Peninsulares. The Spaniards who were born in the Philippines were called Creoles or Criollas. And those of mixed heritage, so it could be combinations of native, Spaniards, Chinese, etc., where they begin intermarrying and then having children, the children of that mixed heritage would be called mestizos. They became very prominent, especially Chinese mestizos, who married in with the Indios and began proudly calling themselves, by the late 19th century, these mestizos, Filipinos. And since there really isn't in the native languages and dialects of the Philippines an F sound, they would actually have referred to themselves as Filipinos. Latin American immigrants also made their way to the Philippines, especially those who were leaving Latin America after the independence movements there of the 19th century. These were many of these were supporters of the Spanish crown, of the Spanish Empire, were not particularly happy with the independence movements in Latin America, and hence, immigrated elsewhere to places like the Philippines. Now, as time went by, there really was a movement of nationalism, a sense of, Filipinos should really be engaging in some of the same rights as the Spaniards themselves. And so there grew up people who referred to themselves as the educated ones, literally ilustrados. These were Filipinos educated in the Spanish language in Western ways, so they were attending schools, and they were using the Spanish language. They were Roman Catholic. They knew what European systems of government looked like. And by the late 19th century, these ilustrados were promoting gradual change. So including, representation in the Spanish Parliament, they wanted that. They wanted clerical equality, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. Freedom of speech, fair taxation, gradual kinds of reforms. Now, the clerical equality factor was interesting because the Roman Catholic Church was so important. It had converted much of the population, most of the people of the Philippines. It was interesting that, the pastors of a lot of parishes, even out in rural areas, that where the, Spanish language was not the common tongue, but more of native dialects, that oftentimes the government intervened and, worked with the church in naming pastors of these churches, of these parishes, who actually were, Peninsulares, or they were, Creoles. And they spoke the Spanish language. Some of them were even Latin American immigrants. And so by the 1860s, there was a concern for the Filipino population and the exploitation that it underwent really at the hands of this kind of Spanish racism. And this concern for, well, let's have Filipino priests speaking local languages as pastors of parishes out in rural areas, etc. This movement was led by 3 Filipino Catholic priests, Jose Burgos, Mariano Gomez, and Jacinta Zamora, all of whom, by the 1870s, when there was a new Spanish governor, and when he saw this as kind of these ideas as sort of revolutionary, he had all 3 executed. So they become really the symbols of a nationalist movement in late 19th century in the Philippines. And you might also note that they're all 3 Catholic priests, which is extremely important because over time, as you'll see here, even up into the present day, the support of the Catholic Church for reforms in and for the care of the poor, etc., in the Philippines has often been very important to seeing that changes occur. Another leader was Jose Rizal, a 5th-generation Chinese mestizo doctor, linguist, and novelist, and as an ilustrado, he promoted a gradualist approach. Now, unfortunately, by the late 1890s, really, even some of the ilustrados, even some of the nationalists that is promoting a gradualist approach, were really implicated in more radical revolutionary schemes like those of the Katipunan, which was a revolutionary society led by Andres Bonifacio. And despite the fact that Rizal refused to join the Katipunan, although Bonifacio really wanted him to do so and urged him to do so, these two, in the minds of the Spanish, governors of the Philippines, really get hooked together in their minds. And so poor Rizal was executed in 1896, although he certainly did not support the more radical Katipunan, which actually led an insurrection on the main island of Luzon in 1896. And like Rizal, Bonifacio was executed in 1897. You can see what's happening here. Spain, although by this time it is a kind of asthmatic, wheezing sort of government in a country in Europe and in the world, it certainly it does not have the glory or the wealth or the influence that it had in the 16 and 1700s. Nevertheless, it is very reluctant to let the Philippines go. It's very reluctant to move the Philippines to independence. If it had been acted differently, perhaps the next stage of history would have been quite different. Well, there is this war called the Spanish-American War that most of you know from American history is a very quick war in 1898. And it starts out with very high principles. We are very concerned, the United States was very concerned that the Cuban peoples, were still under the thumb of the Spanish government, and the Cuban peoples were trying to revolt and declare their independence. So we say, as the leader of democracy in the Western Hemisphere, that this is something that we need to aid and abet and help them with. Of course, we also had many American industrialists and investors, financiers, had many interest in Cuba as well. So we became involved in the Spanish-American War to kind of help Cuba attain its independence. And in the end, negotiations were held in Paris. So a ceasefire was called. Negotiations were held in Paris in 1898. And by the Treaty of Paris, the United States gained from Spain Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Now, nobody talked too much about Cuba and Puerto Rico at the Treaty of Paris in 1898. The big talking point at that point in time was the Philippines. And the reason why was, during the war, Admiral Dewey had steamed into Manila Bay in the Philippines and, quote-unquote, taken Manila and taken down the Philippines and taken it from Spain. Well, in reality, yes, he steamed in and there was a battle and so on and so forth, but really, in order to take it away, to wrench it away from the Spanish, he needed an army of people, an army from the United States, which subsequently followed up and made that naval battle a reality, so to speak. And so all of that part, so Dewey's part had happened during the course of the Spanish-American War, and the armed forces and their invasion occurred after the ceasefire was declared. So some people in Paris were saying, really the United States did not really take the Philippines before the ceasefire occurred, and really therefore should not be having the Philippines after the war. The United States was not about to give up on that point. It had attained earlier on Hawaii in the same year, and Guam, which was part of the negotiations as well in the Spanish-American War, and then the Philippines. So this was from the Hawaiian King, and then this was part of the Spanish-American War. So you can see what's happening here as shown in this map. From San Francisco to Hawaii was 2,200 miles. From Hawaii to Guam, 3,400 miles. From Guam to Manila, another 1,400 miles. In a day of a Navy with steamships, it would be very important to have coaling stations, refueling stations all along the way. And so many writers were speaking about the importance of a strong Navy. The British had a strong Navy, hence the United States needed a strong Navy. And the United States was not only interested in a strong Navy, there was a second reason why it really wanted the Philippines. It wanted it so that it could keep it from being grabbed up by other up-and-coming powers. Who could those up-and-coming powers be? Well, they might be a European power, for instance, like Germany. Perhaps it would be even an Asian power, because Japan was up and coming at that time and starting to grasp, right? Had just had a war with Russia and was starting to grasp up property. And then there was the other concern about China itself in keeping trade open to China. And China, of course, by 1898 was falling apart in the need to kind of have an American base over here. And besides all of that, throughout the 19th century, U.S. companies had invested heavily in the Philippines, establishing plantations for abaca. Abaca is kind of a hemp that was grown to make rope and twine. Also coffee, sugar, and tobacco plantations. So there was an economic interest of the United States as well. Now, during the course of the war, the Filipinos saw a perfect opportunity to declare their independence, which they did in 1898, but found out that the Treaty of Paris wasn't going to give them their independence and that the U.S. was not yet ready to recognize independence and indeed clamp down on the revolutionaries. Interestingly enough, General Arthur MacArthur, father of later the World War II General Douglas MacArthur, was a hero of the Spanish-American War. He defeated the Filipino revolutionary Emilio Aguinaldo in 1899 and became military governor of the Philippines from 1900 to 1901. Now, the U.S. Congress, by the Spooner Amendment of 1901, replaced the military government of the Philippines with a civilian one. And from this point on, really, the United States was preparing the Philippines for eventual independence. It was pouring money into education, healthcare, etc. again, democratizing the Philippines so that it could one day be free. And this made sense because if you think of the whole thing, the Spanish-American War starts out with these very high ideals. We're going to help Cuba free itself. And the Spanish-American War ultimately leads the United States into becoming what it always said it never wanted to be. That is an imperial power. However, all these other factors in the world kind of intervened, and American interests felt that they needed protection and that America needed to protect its back door, so to speak, the Pacific Ocean. In 1934, the U.S. Congress passed a bill stating that independence would come to the Philippines within the next 12 years. And indeed, in 1935, the Philippines became a commonwealth of the U.S. with power over its own domestic affairs, but not over its foreign affairs. And Manuel Quezon became its first president. And, of course, Quezon City is named after him. We all know what happens in World War II. Southeast Asia, it's like dominoes, one after another, falls to the Japanese. In 1942, the Philippines fell to Japan, and at that time, General Douglas MacArthur says and vows, "I will return." And after a very heavy 10-month struggle, the United States and Douglas MacArthur did indeed return to the Philippines. So the U.S. retook the Philippines in 1945 and shortly thereafter kept its promise. And on July 4th of 1946, the U.S. gave, very symbolic, of course, July 4th, its independence to the Philippines. From 1946 to 1972, the Philippines was a constitutional democracy, albeit it was a very young one and it was struggling. One of the things that it was struggling with that would continue to remain a problem and still remains a problem today, as we mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, is, this economic inequality between the haves and the have-nots. The Hucks felt, and they ran for the Congress in the Philippines, and they were not allowed to be seated. Even though they won a number of seats, they were not allowed to be seated. The Hucks felt that there should be some land redistribution, that land ought to be given to the tillers of the land. They were seen as almost communist, and their rebellion, although it attracted many people in the rural areas, did not attract the elite and did not attract those in the urban areas, and was put down by the Philippine Armed Forces. In 1965, and then again in 1969, Ferdinand Marcos was elected president of the Philippines. The Constitution of the Philippines did not allow a third term. And worried about that, and also worried about kind of the economic problems that were occurring. So what he could do is, he could kind of justify declaring martial law in 1972 by saying, we have a number of major problems. And he had convinced himself that, he was going to be the savior of the Philippines. And so he declares martial law, so the Constitution is put aside, and he declares a new society which is going to promise all kinds of reforms, but in reality was just a sham. It practiced, as your books, your readings for this week say, a kind of a crony capitalism. So, yes, he got rid of many of the landed elite, and instead, his cronies, his friends, his colleagues kind of took over control. And he replaced that landed oligarchy not only with his own cronies, but with the power of the military, which pretty well allied itself with the Marcos regime as well. He had problems throughout the 1980s. Armed forces were fighting. The Philippine Armed Forces, were fighting the Moro Nationalist Liberation Front in Mindanao, as well as the Communist New People's Party. That would go on to the 1990s and even into the 21st century, and even isn't already, to this day, not completely settled. And then in 1983, a man who had been a critic and opponent of Ferdinand Marcos, Benigno Aquino, decided that it was time for him to return from exile in the United States. And he's landing in the plane and getting off the plane in Manila. He is shot. He is assassinated. And, people are very upset by this. In 1986, Marcos has a new election, and it's a fraudulent election. And he claims to have won, and everybody knows he didn't win. There's widespread protests. And all of a sudden, the Catholic cardinals, seen of Manila, and the Catholic bishops all decide that they need to join with the protesters. They need to join the opposition. And it's really an heroic opposition from the Catholic bishops, the archbishops, who helped to topple Marcos. Marcos and his wife, Imelda, took billions of dollars of stuff from the Philippines all across the years. Imelda was, she bought everything she could ever think of, and one of her weaknesses was shoes. So, when people moved into the presidential palace after this and found thousands and thousands of shoes, then, there were worldwide, everyone was talking about Imelda Marcos's shoes. Anyhow, they fled to the United States, and Corazon Aquino, who was the widow of Benigno Aquino, became president at that time. Now, as the Filipinos are literally kind of discovering their own sense of nationalism, and as all this is happening, they're wanting to throw off the last vestiges in their mind of colonialism, and in this case of American colonialism. So they were not at all for renewing any of the leases on U.S. military bases, on the air base at Clark or on the naval base at Subic Bay. Those were turned down, and as it turns out, in 1991, a volcanic explosion near the Clark Air Base pretty well determined that it wasn't going to be much use to the Americans anymore. And after the end of the Cold War in 1989-90, Subic Bay wasn't really regarded as critical either. So by 1991-92, the U.S. abandoned Clark Air Force Base and then the naval base at Subic Bay. In 1992, Fidel Ramos was elected as president, did some good things as your books describe, your readings described. I'll let you read about that yourself. In 1998, Joseph Estrada, an actor, became president. There was corruption he was involved in, forcing him to resign in 2001, at which time Vice President Gloria Arroyo, who was a former economist, became president, and she did some neat things as well in terms of the economy. She was then elected in 2004, and by this time you may note, according to the Constitution, the president served for 6 years. So she served until 2010. After 2010, she was accused of some corruption, taking some funds. She spent a little time in jail, as I recall, etc. And then in 2010, and he still serves now as president of the Philippines, Benigno Aquino III was elected as president. He's the son of Benigno and Corazon Aquino. Now, the other thing that one needs to understand about the Philippines, and that might be helpful to you, is an understanding of the importance of harmony. Like many places in the world which still have, a fairly large rural population, there is this emphasis on the importance of family. And that makes sense in an agricultural kind of rural setting. That was certainly true of the United States and Europe, where the importance of family and multi-generations multiple generations of a family, of this extended kind of kinship, is important in agricultural societies. And that still is the flavor of the Philippines, even in the urban areas. The importance of family, of extended family, of taking care of family, and of obligations to one's family. And of not doing anything which would lead to letting your family down, to embarrassing somehow your family. And all of this is still kind of that Asian sense of the need for harmony. So there is that underlying sense of everybody needs to try to get along. And so if you ask a Filipino, would you come to a party that I'm holding? And they say yes, you don't know what yes really means. This is also kind of part of that Spanish, Latin American, and Asian blend. The same is true sometimes of the Latin American and Spanish responses to things. Oftentimes, yes doesn't necessarily mean yes. Yes could mean yes, yes could mean maybe, yes could mean no, but there is this tendency to not want to offend people and to maintain harmony. And part of all that is something which, grew out of the Spanish colonial culture, and which was very prevalent in Latin American society and is very prevalent in the Philippines today. And it's sort of these patron-client relationships. And by patron-client relationships, we're really talking about, someone who is a client and then has a relationship, economic, political, working relationship, friendship, whatever, with someone who is higher up on the socioeconomic scale, literally a patron. So to give you an example, and this is outside of kind of the family connections. Okay, so you have the harmony of society overlaying all of this, and then you have the importance of the family relationships, and under that harmony you also have the importance of these extra-familial, outside of the family, patron-client relationships. So it could be, that a fairly wealthy person, maybe they're your boss, maybe they're a neighbor, maybe there's somebody at church, just kind of likes you and is your godfather. Maybe he's been your godfather from the time, you were baptized as an infant. Or maybe he becomes the godfather of your own child. And maybe he even helps you find a job someplace, or, helps you, in loaning you some money, or whatever the case might be. So there's this sense of responsibility of the client then to do what the patron expects of them. And so there's this larger network of relationships that underscores and makes sometimes difficult, if this makes sense, a democratic system which is not where a democratic system where sometimes bribes and so forth can be used to sort of get things done in order to kind of grease the wheels, so to speak, in getting things done. That's typical of Latin America as well, and sometimes in the United States, where the sense of harmony is not what we have, but we have more of a sense of individualism, and where we have much less emphasis on family and the extended family, and where these patron-client relationships are really unknown in our society. It's difficult for us to understand how their democracy works versus our democracy, and how it seems sometimes more prone to bribes and corruption, even among those who are presidents and in the upper elite. So that's all for this week, and I hope you've enjoyed the class in general. If you should have any questions, feel free to email me or phone me. I'm always happy to help. Thank you and have a good